Well, it's really wonderful to have all of you here tonight. And I'm especially glad for Richard's advocacy and hospitality and asking Dr. Tony Ingraffea to, am I saying that correct, Tony?
It's good enough.
What's that?
Ingraffea.
Ingraffea?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's at least, we'll try to at least get your name correct. That's the least we could do here, maybe. So Ingraffea.
You can call
Um,
me, you can call me Al.
Okay, as long as we
I'm
call you for
kidding. I'm
dinner, is that
kidding.
how it goes?
I'm kidding.
Yep.
With deference to Paul Simon.
Well, it's really a joy to have you with us here tonight. And as it's 6 o'clock, I think Richard's gonna have a few words of an introduction for us. So Richard, you go right ahead.
Thank you, Bishop. So we're extremely grateful to have Tony with us this evening. The Greenidge plant on Seneca Lake raises some very important and frankly troubling issues regarding the local environment, the air and water quality, but no less importantly, and perhaps more importantly, the contribution to climate change. And the particular reason that happens is because the plant is devoted to Bitcoin mining, and Tony will talk to us a little bit about that. But the overall impact of Bitcoin mining is enormous in terms of its contribution to greenhouse gases and climate change. This plant is one of several in New York State and so this in effect is sort of a test case of other plants that could be brought into service for that same purpose. And that happens against the larger backdrop that Bitcoin mining activity, which previously was largely done in China, is in the process of migrating to the United States because the Chinese government has basically thrown them out, both because of the monetary regulation concerns, but no less importantly the environmental aspects. So Tony has an extensive resume and many credentials. His title is that he is the Dwight C. Baum Professor of Engineering at the Cornell Engineering School. He was for many years a consultant in the energy industry, then turned to teaching. He's authored over 200 articles in related topics. And most recently, he's been involved in the environmental sector, seeking to protect the environment, and had deep involvement in the fracking controversy, which was very important in central New York. So what I'd like to do is ask Bishop Dede to say a few words, and following that, Tony can begin his presentation. Let me just add that in terms of housekeeping, this presentation is being recorded, and it'll be put up on the Diocese Facebook page afterwards. So hopefully that's okay with everybody. And if you have questions during the course of the presentation, please put them in the chat, and I'll keep track of them and raise them. Hopefully, Tony will be able to leave a few minutes at the end to respond to questions. So with that, Bishop Dede.
Dear friends, the Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Holy God, we come before you recognizing your love and grace in our midst. We ask that you would be present in this time, that you would open our hearts and minds to the truth and the reality of what is happening in the world around us, that you would give us discerning hearts, Lord, willing and able to not only be inspired and challenged and encouraged, but also that what we hear today would stir within us a conviction to act, Lord, that we would be part of a positive and healthy change for ourselves, for our communities, and especially for this fragile earth, our island home. Thank you, Lord, for this opportunity. Be present to us in this space. Come, Lord, that we may learn and reason together. In your name we pray. Amen. I want to thank all of you who are joining and for the climate care team that has been assembled for Richard and his advocacy and making sure we make this connection with Dr. Ingraffea. And I especially am encouraged because I recently just learned about this situation myself about 4 months ago or so. And my hope is that we can all become advocates for not only education to our neighbors and friends, but that we can really work together to advocate for the safety and security of our planet and our communities. So, Dr. Ingraffea, thank you so much for being with us. And with that, please, we look forward to learning from you about this. So, welcome.
Well, thank you all very much for the invitation to be with you tonight. And it's an honor to try to share my knowledge, experience related to this issue with you. I'm looking forward to trying to fill in the gaps of knowledge that some of you might have. I'm fully aware that many of the things I'm going to say tonight are familiar to you. You might already know them. I'm also sure that if I get too deeply into the weeds, that there'll be an opportunity later for me to clarify some of the technical issues that we're going to talk about. But let me begin by saying I want to thank two of my colleagues, Irene Weiser and Renee Santoro, for helping me with this presentation. They are passionately concerned about the things that we're concerned about, and they've been very, very helpful.
The camera's off.
So what I know about, as Richard alluded to, is how to get oil and gas out of the ground. For over 25 years, I was a consultant to the oil and gas industry while being a professor at Cornell. And then about 12 years ago, I became basically their worst enemy. I saw what they were doing with the development of what people call fracking, which is really just a name associated with getting oil and gas out of shale. That's the stuff, the rock that you see behind me. So I'm very familiar with the technologies. I keep up to date with the technologies. I'm familiar with the jargon. I understand the ethos of these corporations when they have it. But having said that, I should point out that I am not an ethicist. I'm not a Bitcoin expert. So I'm going to confine my comments tonight to that which I know a lot about, which is what kind of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are coming out of this plant. And not only this plant, but plants like it, not only around New York State, but around the world. And I'm going to do my best to try to inform you of how I can tell you what those emissions are with great confidence. So this is very much an engineering presentation. It's very much technology and engineering oriented. I'll leave it to you to make the relevant, important judgments about what to do with this information as individuals and as a group. I know what I'm doing with it. So let's proceed. So I have an ambitious agenda, but I am going to leave time. We have an hour. I'm going to begin by talking very briefly about the history of this plant, how Greenidge intends to use its electricity generated from this plant. How does this plant generate electricity? That's very important to understand the types of emissions and the magnitude of the emissions. What are the plant's emissions of greenhouse gases? How does Greenidge go about estimating these emissions, as they must do to satisfy DEC? And then, is that estimate scientifically correct? And is it in accordance with the recent mandates of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is a new law that comes after, unfortunately, the current DEC regulations? So I will uncover tonight some of the inconsistencies in the application of rules and regulations. And I'll make the statement again and again that Greenidge is sliding through loopholes because of that. I'll then talk about how large those emissions are in a relative sense. There'll be some big numbers, but the big numbers don't mean anything unless you can compare them to something that you appreciate. Then I'll spend a bit of time answering very important questions. Will the plant meet the emission targets that New York State now has because of the CLCPA? These are very aggressive targets. Will this plant be able to meet those targets? And will the plant be required to throttle back its Bitcoin operation in order to meet the first very important target, which is in 2030, only 8.5 years from now, 9.5, whatever. I don't know what year it is. And then I'm going to conclude by talking about what's beyond Seneca. This is not the only Bitcoin mining operation at a formerly coal-fired power plant on the face of the earth. There are now somewhere between 300 and 600 of them. So what we're talking about today goes beyond us. So that's the agenda. I'm going to dive in. I try to go slowly so we can all keep up with each other. History. This plant went into service before I was born, 10 years before I was born. It's older than me. It originally had 3 separate generators, and I'll describe what a generator is in a slide or two, but the newest piece of equipment in the plant was added in 1953, so it's slightly younger than me. But as of 2009, only one of those original 3 generators remained, and it's the only one currently in use, and it will be the only one that can be used. The plant retired as a public servicing electricity generating plant, part of the network of generating plants around New York State. It retired in 2011. Went out of business. And the owners at that point said, we're going out of business because there's a low demand for electricity in the area that it served. This is not a high electricity demand area. And they could no longer compete because they were burning coal. They could no longer compete with gas-powered generating plants. Fast forward 3 years, the plant was purchased, as you know, by Greenidge Holdings, private investment firm. And they had plans, some of which were quickly revealed, others of which were hidden from the public until a few years later. So in 2016, they received a $10 million regional economic development fund to build a gas pipeline to bring natural gas to this plant so that it would no longer burn coal to generate electricity. It would hereafter burn natural gas. And they went through all of the bureaucratic procedures of receiving permits from the Public Service Commission of New York and the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York. And of course, they had to have gotten the blessing of our dear governor to operate as what is called a peaker plant. That is a power plant that would send electricity for public service to the grid, but only when demand for it arose. That is, the plant would not operate 24/7. It would not operate every day of the year. It would only operate when there was a demand for it. And when that happened, the first thing I realized 5 years ago was that this was a sham. Why would somebody invest millions of their own dollars and get millions of state taxpayers' dollars to run an operation that was never going to make a profit? You can't make money as a relatively old peaker plant. So what was being hidden was that there were bigger and better plans in the minds of Greenidge that weren't initially revealed to the public. It wasn't until 2019 that Greenidge proposed a new business model for the plant. They would no longer be generating electricity to the grid for public good. They would operate as a private electricity generator for their own purposes to mine Bitcoins. So they formed a new business enterprise called Greenidge Coin. And they announced a plan that they would ratchet up the plant's ability to generate electricity in 3 steps. Remember, they only had 1 remaining operable generator of the 3 that were originally in the plant. So they would start relatively small by generating 14 megawatts. MW means a million watts. They have since ratcheted up to 25 megawatts, 25 million watts. And they could, and they will, according to their business plan, soon be operating at the maximum capacity of the remaining generator, which is 106 million watts. So what's a million watts? That's a big number. A million watts is basically the average demand for 500 homes. So 106 megawatts would be enough electricity to continuously supply the electricity demand for 50,000 homes. That gives you a sense of scale. So this is not a small operation. It's not huge by electricity generating standards. That would be 1,000 megawatts, but it's not small either. Why would Greenidge Coin want to use 106 megawatts of electricity? Well, they're mining Bitcoin, and to do that, you need enormous computing power. And as I said, I'm not a Bitcoin expert. I'm not going to get into the whys and the wherefores of how you mine for a Bitcoin. Suffice it to say that you have to solve an extremely complex equation. And to do that, you need massive computer power. So right now they have installed about 8,500 computer servers. Think of a server as equivalent to one desktop computer, although each of their servers is much more powerful than any desktop computer that you or I have. But as you know, when a computer runs, it generates heat. And so they have to cool this building in which they put 8,500 computers. And to do that, they need massive air conditioning. Air conditioning is measured in tons. For example, to cool my home, which is relatively modest, 2,500 square feet, takes about 6 tons of air conditioning. They need thousands of tons of air conditioning. And as you know, air conditioners require electricity. So there you have it. They eventually will generate 106 megawatts, some of which will go to powering the computers, some of which will go to powering the air conditioning. The next question I wanted to answer for you, and this goes right to the heart of the emissions issue, which is the heart of the issue. How does this plant generate electricity? I know you're all really interested in the nitty-gritties of how to generate electricity. So this particular plant, as I said, built in 1938, that's antediluvian by electricity generating standards. Nowadays, you can generate electricity without any moving parts using a solar panel. Well, back then, what they did was set up a system where they would burn something, sort of like cavemen burnt things to warm their caves. And originally, they burned coal to boil water. That's the heart of a simple cycle steam turbine plant. You boil water to create steam. Steam is under pressure. It's injected into a turbine, something that spins with a lot of blades on it. And the steam makes this turbine spin. And the spinning turbines turns an electrical generator. And the generator generates electricity. And initially, the electricity from this plant went to the grid for public service. You need water to generate steam. So the water was taken out of Seneca Lake. And some of the water was used actually in the cycle of generating steam. But once the steam has generated power through the turbine, it's sent into a condenser where it condenses back out of steam and into water. So this is sort of a closed cycle use of water. But in order to get it to condense from hot steam to cold water, you have to cool it. So they would take water, cooling water out of Seneca Lake at somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and then return it to Seneca Lake at about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're sending something like 106 million gallons per day of 50 to 60 degree temperature water from the lake and putting that same amount of water back into the lake 50 degrees hotter. And that has environmental consequences about which I am not expert, but what you've heard. Not necessarily good for algal blooms, not necessarily good for fish life. That's an environmental issue that I'm not expert in. I'm not going to talk much any more about it, but it's another issue that's very important. So the reason why I'm pointing to this particular picture is because, as I said before, it's antediluvian. It's the simplest, worst in terms of efficiency way of generating electricity. Of all the ways to generate electricity, this is the worst. You boil water to create steam, and you use steam to turn a turbine to turn the generator. And in engineering terms, this plant is about 30% efficient. What that means is, of all the energy in the natural gas that they're burning, only 30% of that energy gets converted into electricity. The rest of it is waste heat. It goes up the stack, along with carbon dioxide, and along with methane, and along with nitrogen oxides. All these are greenhouse gases. So Greenidge acquired a defunct coal-fired power plant, a piece of junk, and they're using a piece of junk of very low efficiency to mine Bitcoins. One of the reasons I'm pointing this out is they had an option. Greenidge could have taken their investment capital and updated the plant. They could have gone out and thrown away their steam turbine and bought a gas turbine. That would give them an increase in efficiency. They wouldn't need to take water out of the lake for cooling, but they'd have to invest more money, and they didn't. So that would be a simple cycle gas turbine. You burn gas, natural gas. The gas turbine, very similar to what's on a jet airplane, same principle, turns a generator. Generator creates electricity. It used to go out to the way it would have gone out to the grid, but they could have used the electricity for Bitcoin mining. They chose not to do this investment. If they were really concerned, really seriously concerned about climate, they would have run their numbers. I don't mean Bitcoin numbers, I mean their dollar and cents numbers, and said, well, the most efficient way for us to generate electricity with this plant was to throw out the steam turbine and employ a combined cycle gas turbine, which would be 60 to 80% efficient, more than twice as efficient as the piece of junk that they had. And that would have resulted in much lower emissions. A combined cycle gas turbine not only has a gas turbine, but a steam turbine. They take the heat that's coming out of the back of the gas turbine. As you know, when you see a jet engine on an airplane, what's coming out the back of that jet engine is a lot of hot air, very hot. Well, they can use that to boil water. So this is a combined cycle. They generate electricity both by burning gas and by creating steam. Combined cycle, twice the efficiency. This is what Cornell University uses for generating electricity and generating steam, both to power and to heat the Cornell campus. So that's how Greenidge generates their electricity, and it's how they could have, had they decided to invest more money up front, and had they been better stewards of the environment, they could have done a better job. They chose not to. Talk a little bit more about efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions. I'm making a big point about how inefficient that plant is. Well, it turns out that the dirtiest, the climate dirtiest, the worst thing you can do for climate if you're going to generate electricity is to burn natural gas to create steam. I'll go farther. A paper that two of my colleagues and I wrote back in 2011, which has now become quite infamous to the extent that it now has over 1,600 citations in the scientific literature. For those of you who don't know what a citation is, at least 1,600 other papers have referred to our paper. because we said that even if you were to have the most efficient combined cycle gas and steam turbine situation and chose to generate electricity that way, it would still be worse than burning coal to generate electricity. And when we wrote that paper, we got a lot of pushback from the White House all the way down to Houston. How could that possibly be? There's a lot less carbon dioxide emitted when you burn natural gas than when you burn coal. Well, they weren't taking into account methane. Just weren't doing it. So the Greenidge plant, I just pointed out, doesn't use a very high efficiency combined cycle plant. It's a simple cycle, very low, lowest possible efficiency way to generate electricity. And therefore, I make the claim, Greenidge has the highest possible emission rate per Bitcoin mined. They could not think of a worse way to generate Bitcoins from a climate point of view than to do what they're doing. That's a technically accurate statement. So this is the title of the paper that we wrote. I pointed out that it's now well referenced. It's used as a landmark paper, one that really changed the way a lot of people think around the world. And the key picture, graph, chart, bar chart that we had in the paper is this one, so I'll explain it to you. It's an attempt to show the relative emissions per unit of energy generated. That's this vertical axis. Number of grams of carbon from both carbon dioxide and methane. Carbon dioxide, as you know, is CO2. Methane is CH4. They both have carbon atoms in them. So the number of grams of carbon per megajoule of energy, that's a measure of how much electricity is generated. We compared the emissions of both carbon dioxide and methane if you were to burn diesel to generate the electricity, if you were to burn coal, if you were to burn conventional gas, that is gas not coming from a shale formation like the one behind me, or if your gas was coming from a shale formation, and you were using an extremely highly efficient combined cycle turbine. This horizontal black line, the dotted line, says the lowest possible estimate that we made says that burning shale gas is dirtier than burning coal. And the highest estimate is much dirtier than burning coal. And that's if you have a very highly efficient plant. And I just said that the Greenidge plant is the dirtiest possible way to mine Bitcoins. So I'm absolutely confident, technically, scientifically, in what I'm saying. Playing games with numbers. One of the topics I wanted to talk about tonight is how do people estimate emissions associated with Bitcoin mining? That's the root of the problem here. I want to get to a number. I want to show you, here is the number of tons of CO2 and methane that plant emits every year. Well, there are old methods for making that calculation. And unfortunately, at this point in time, 2021, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation is still mandating the use of the old method. So when Greenidge applied for a permit to operate a private power plant, they used the calculation method that DEC said they had to use. But that method doesn't account properly for methane. It's scientifically antiquated. And that's a statement that is true. It's not my opinion. It's so true that when our legislators passed and the governor signed this New York State law, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, it requires that both carbon dioxide and methane have to be included in emissions, and not only the methane that's emitted at the plant, but everywhere upstream of the plant. And that's a critically important issue. What do I mean by upstream? Where is the gas that this plant is burning at this moment coming from? It's coming from shale gas wells in Pennsylvania. Somebody had to drill those wells. And when they drilled those wells, methane was emitted. They have to connect the pipeline to those wells. But before they connect the pipeline, they have to frack the wells. And for some period of time, weeks or months after they frack the wells, there's a large amount of methane that is either being vented or flared at each well. Then the methane has to go into a pipeline, where it then has to go to a compressor station. At a compressor station, there are methane emissions. All along the pipeline, there are leaks of methane. It then has to go to a storage unit where there's leaking of methane. It then goes into a distribution pipeline system under the streets in our cities, which leak. The methane eventually goes into your kitchen, where you burn it in your stove, but you don't burn all of it. Some of it doesn't get burned. The point I'm making is from the time they drill the well to the time the methane gets to your stove or to the Greenidge plant, there's leakage of methane into the atmosphere. And Greenidge is ignoring it. They're playing games. They know just as well as I know that there are more scientifically accurate ways of computing their emissions, but right now they're hiding behind a set of regulations from DEC that will be replaced soon by the CLCPA. But until that time, they can lie to the public. They can cloud the issue and say, well, we're doing exactly what the state requires us to do, but you're not doing the science correctly, and you know that. You're being disingenuous. So Greenidge is undercounting its methane emissions because they're not counting all the upstream emissions, which they're now will be required to do. But they're also assigning the methane less impact on climate, because this old method that they're using says that methane is only 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a global warming greenhouse gas. But that's old science. That's 1990. The correct science is that methane, when it gets into the atmosphere over a period of 20 years, is 72 to 100 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So again, Greenidge is being disingenuous. They're undercounting their emissions by not counting upstream emissions, and the emissions that they are counting at the plant, which are minuscule, they're using old science to compare those methane emissions to their carbon dioxide emissions by a factor of at least 3. So what are the emissions? We finally get to numbers. So here's a table. I'll take my time explaining it. This column is the amount of power that's being produced at the Greenidge plant. As I said, they started off with only running the plant at 14 megawatts. They're currently running it somewhere around 25 megawatts, but they can run it at the full capacity of the remaining generator, which is 106 megawatts. When they applied for a permit from DEC, they did the old method calculation for both carbon dioxide and methane. And here are the numbers they came up with in tons per year. Don't mind the funny spelling of tons, that's a metric ton, just 10% more than a regular ton. So at 14 megawatts, they're putting out 75,000 tons of CO2 and methane every year, if they run the plant 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for that year. And we'll address that question in a minute. Right now, they're putting out the equivalent of 134,000 tons of carbon dioxide and methane. And when they get the plant up to full capacity, 568,000 tons. That's the old method. With the new method, which CLCPA is mandating must be used as soon as the DEC updates its regulations in conformance with the CLCPA, look what happens to those numbers. It's almost a factor of 2. As I said before, as somebody can look at big numbers and your eyes start crossing and wonder what's 100,000, what's a million. So I'm giving you something that you should all understand. There are 110,000 people in Tompkins County, give or take a few hundred. And every day throughout the year, those 110,000 people go about their business, running businesses, heating their homes, driving their cars, making hot water, cooking their meals, washing and drying their clothes. And last year, those 110,000 people collectively emitted 1 million tons of carbon dioxide and methane. This one power plant running for private gain, private profit, is putting as much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as our entire county. So the permit that Greenidge currently has for operating their plant says you cannot emit more than 642,878 tons of carbon dioxide and methane in a year. And they're saying, good, look at this. This number, 568, is a lot smaller than this number, so we can fire up that steam turbine and run it at full capacity 24/7, 365. There's no reason to ever shut it down because we have a permit to emit that much. When in fact, scientific fact, they're going to be emitting at least this much, which would far exceed their permit. Why? Because their permit is based on the old method. I think you got it by now. I'm beating a dead horse. Question, would they really run this plant 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the next 30 or 40 years? Why would they do that? That brings us to the topic of capacity factors. I know it's jargon, but let me tell you what it is. A capacity factor is a fraction, a percentage of the highest possible usage that is actually used. So if the plant could run, theoretically, technically, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 365 days, if its capacity factor was 100, that means it's running 24/7, 365. If its capacity factor is less, that means it's shut down for some period of time. Well, the plant up until 2019, starting in 2016, 2019, it ran as a peaker plant. I told you about that. It was generating electricity for public service. And then last year is operating as this sham. It was operating at 6% capacity. 6% of the time it was turned on, 94% of the time it was turned off. And you're going to tell me that this investment firm invested in this plant in order to have the plant idle 94% of the time? They knew. They knew from day one that they were going to do something else with it, and that's operate it 100% of the time. And now they're bragging about it. Go to the Greenidge website, and here's a quote from the CEO of Greenidge. As power plant operators with a unique commitment to environmental stewardship, running assets reliably 24/7, 365 days per year is in our DNA. No, it's in your bank account. And if they do run their plant 24/7, 365, they currently are bragging that they're making $50,000 a day mining Bitcoins. And as I said, those are the most climate expensive Bitcoins produced anywhere on Earth, in my opinion. Next to last topic. Well, wait a minute, the CLCPA has targets. right? Everybody knows by now that the CLCPA, Climate Leadership Community Protection Act says, for example, all electricity generated in New York State by 2030 has to be 70% renewable. And by 2040 has to be 100% carbon free. But that's only for public serving, load serving entities, power plants that are actually sending electricity to the grid so that you and I can use it to charge our electric cars, heat our homes with heat pumps, and do all those wonderful things that green electricity will enable us to do. So that mandate is not applicable to Greenidge because it's a private power plant. It's behind the grid, behind the meter. It's private. But wait a minute, you say, wait, that's not the only mandate from the CLCPA. The CLCPA also says that there's a requirement for commercial and industrial operations, which is what Greenidge actually is. It's a commercial operation. They have to reduce their emissions by 40% by 2030 relative to what the emissions were in 1990. I'm pausing for effect here because I'm sure that since everybody in upstate New York is above average intelligence, you're detecting at this point a but, a however, a wait a minute. What were the plant's emissions in 1990? They don't have to drop 40% from yesterday or 40% from tomorrow. They have to drop their emissions 40% from what they were in 1990 before Greenidge even owned the plant, when it was operating as a power generation plant for the grid. Loophole, big one. In 1990, that power plant was generating electricity to the grid using 2 generators. 2, not the one that's remaining, but the one that's remaining plus an older one. And those 2 combined for 167 megawatts. If you reduce 167 megawatts by 40%, what do you get? Take a guess. See the loophole? They don't have to do a damn thing, pardon my French. In order to meet that 2030 deadline, that target, 40% reduction, they can raise their hand now and say, we already did it. Even though, as I point out here, their actual emissions would be 25 times higher than they were in the last year that the plant operated in public service. Absurdity. Enabled by loopholes in the law. Now, some of you know that there was an attempt in the last session of the New York State Legislature to get a new law passed that would cause a moratorium to come into existence for new Bitcoin mining in New York State. And as you know, that proposed law failed, did not pass. Trying to close some of the loopholes. So let me summarize what I told you so far, and then we get into the last segment of our interaction, which is what's beyond New York State, what's beyond Seneca Lake in New York State, and then what's beyond New York State with respect to climate change impacts of Bitcoin mining. So a quick question and answer here. I told you I was going to tell you how Greenidge was going to generate electricity or why it was going to do it. They're doing it for private investors, not for public good. How do they generate electricity? The least efficient way possible. What is emitted from the plant? Both carbon dioxide and methane, including methane that's upstream. That plant is creating demand. It's creating a demand for new wells to be drilled in Pennsylvania. It's creating a demand for new wells in Pennsylvania to be fracked. It's creating a demand for more pipeline services. It's creating a demand for compressor stations to operate. It's creating a demand for storage of natural gas. And all those things leak. How does Greenidge estimate its emissions? Using 1990 science. Well, but that's all they were asked to do. So that's all they're doing, even though they know better. Is that estimate scientifically correct and in accordance with the mandates of CLCPA? No and no. How large are the emissions, relatively speaking? As large as those from Tompkins County. Will the plant need to meet CLCPA's emissions reduction targets? No, not with the current rules. Will the plant be required to throttle back its operation by 2030 to meet the 40% reduction requirement? No, not with current rules. We're stuck. This is just the beginning. As Richard pointed out in his introductory comments, there was an earthquake change in international Bitcoin mining in the last 2 years. And that earthquake change, which I'll talk about in the next slides, is manifest in this slide, which says there are now 6 recently retired, formerly coal-fired power plants in upstate New York. I've identified them here. One of them is Greenidge. That's this one. If we look at the combined megawattage capacity of those 6 plants, 2,130 megawatts, 20 times that of Greenidge. So if all 6 of those plants find themselves creating Bitcoins 24/7, 365, you multiply all those greenhouse gas emissions I just talked about by 20 times. So what was this earthquake that shattered previous ways of doing business for Bitcoin mining internationally? China, starting in 2019, said no more Bitcoin mining in China. The chairman says it's not good for China. We're going to shut you all down. So today, literally, yesterday, I went online yesterday and got these numbers. Yesterday, on the face of the earth, all the Bitcoin mining that was occurring was using somewhere between 3 gigawatts, not megawatts, gigawatts. A gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, and 20 gigawatts. And the best estimate by experts is somewhere around 8 gigawatts. Well, again, it's a number. I don't know what, you don't know what that means. I don't know what that means unless we compare it to something. So we can compare it to the electricity consumption of countries, not Tompkins County, but countries. So yesterday, Bitcoin mining was consuming 70.5 terawatts. A terawatt is 1,000 gigawatt hours, which is 1 million megawatt hours. So the numbers get big because we're now talking about the earth. That's about the same amount of electricity that Colombia, the country, uses, more than the electricity that Austria uses. Where is the Bitcoin mining being done? Richard and I already hinted that it used to be done mostly in China. Here's the graph. Here's October 2019. Here's April 2021. The yellow is China. The blue is the US. Look at the chart and tell me what you see. This is the percentage of all the Bitcoins mined on the face of the earth. Back in 2019, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 75% of them were mined in China. 5% of them were mined in the US. as of April of this year, 10, 20, 30, 45% in China and dropping fast, and 10, 20% in the US, factor of 4 increase. So the US is on its way to becoming the #1 Bitcoin mining on Earth, Bitcoin mining country on Earth. And with that, thank you for inviting me. I think I saved time for some Q&A. And so let's do it.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Tony. This was extremely helpful and a tad depressing, but I mean, those are the facts. And I guess the question is what happens next? So just a few questions for you. Maybe first one, just to clear away an issue of terminology. And I know you say you're not an expert in the mechanics of Bitcoin. What is Bitcoin mining? And I can try this one if you'd prefer.
This is a pedestrian explanation. Some person, a single individual on the face of the earth, decided some years ago that what humanity should have is something that was public serving, a non-governmental way of exchanging goods for services using a monetary unit. Right? $1 is a way of exchanging goods and services with a monetary unit supported by the United States government. What this person said is it would be better for mankind if the government wasn't really in control of that. And so he invented Bitcoin mining with some very esoteric idea. He said, let there be an extremely complex mathematical equation. And I say that if you can solve that equation, you earn money. In other words, it's not a gold standard. We're not basing Bitcoin on gold. We're basing it on calculation capability, on computing capability. Those who can compute the fastest and the best create coins that have value. And since not everybody can do that, these coins can become very valuable. Not everybody has gold in their backyard, right? That's what makes it valuable. It's rare. And like Facebook and the internet, what started off being what appeared to be something that was socially good has unintended consequences. And you all know what those are with respect to cryptocurrency. So that's what those computers are doing. They're trying to solve an insanely complex equation with insanely complex software running software.
And the reason for those insanely complicated math equations assigned to each individual Bitcoin transaction is that there's no central registry. There's no book anywhere or electronic book or any other register of Bitcoin. So if I want to transfer my Bitcoin to you, we have to use this algorithm, this computerized formula.
It's a management algorithm. Yep.
Right. And in order to keep people from stealing it, we make it very complex. And therefore, the need for that kind of complexity and the auditing power to get at it and see if the code can be broken. If the code can't be broken, then my transfer to you is secure and I've transferred money to you or Bitcoin.
As a tax attorney, you know this stuff better than I do, Richard.
Well, yeah, but that's so mining is really a slangy term.
Yes,
People using a lot of computing power to make these transactions go ahead.
Yeah, but there are direct analogies to having a bank account and having cash in the bank account. You know, and I know that every month we get a statement from our bank that says, here are the transactions that you did, and they're guaranteed by our bank to be accurate because we have a management system that makes sure when your checks get cashed and when your credit card bills come due, all the accounting is done correctly. And by the way, Uncle Sam is watching over everything.
Correct.
In cryptocurrency, Uncle Sam isn't, except maybe the NSA or the CIA. Maybe they're watching over things. We hope, given the abuses of cryptocurrency recently.
Well, yeah, the ransomware guys seem satisfied that the system still works for them or they wouldn't be in business.
Right.
So if the NSA and the CIA are watching, they're keeping it to themselves. Okay, so that's good. Turning to the CLCPA, all these targets for 2030, 2040, 2050, or 60, do those meet, to clarify, or just to maybe restate, do any of those have any significance for Greenidge under present law?
The only one that would have significance is the 2045 90% reduction in greenhouse gases.
Okay, but
Because
that's
at that relative to 1990. So they would have to throttle back from 167 megawatts to 10% of that, 16 megawatts. That's the only thing at this point that I can detect has any relevance.
and that, I'm sorry, that's 2045.
2045, and that's 24 years from now. And
Yeah.
at
Okay.
$50,000 a day of Bitcoin mining, or whatever.
Right.
Okay, so our kids and grandkids have to deal with this plant operating
Yes.
unless there is some major change in rules and regulations that would become applicable.
And the change in the DEC's way of reckoning, greenhouse gases that's required by CLCPA will not change that. The only marker that Greenidge needs to worry about is the 2045 marker.
That's my reading. Yes.
Okay, fine. Terrible answer, but I get your point. So what about carbon offsets? Greenidge is very fond of saying that they're very sensitive to environmental concerns, and they're buying carbon offsets to neutralize the impact on the environment. What say you to that?
Richard, I guessed that was going to be a question. So look at the screen.
Yeah.
I came up with at least 4 major counter arguments to Greenidge claiming Greenidge is greenwashing themselves by saying, oh, but wait a minute, we're paying millions of dollars a year to offset our carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Number one, they're not paying to offset their methane emissions because according to them, there are no methane emissions. So they're underpaying for the offset. I grant them they're paying millions of dollars to offset their CO2 emissions, but they're getting away with not paying for the methane emissions, which are equally important, turns out. All right. Second, here's a quote from many places you can go to try to understand carbon offsets. Carbon offsets make environmental and economic sense for emissions that are impossible to reduce. I know a very quick way to reduce emissions from Greenidge.
Yeah.
Shut it down.
Yeah.
Next, carbon offsetting in today's environment, climate change environment, is a delaying tactic. Carbon offsetting doesn't result in a net decrease necessarily in emissions.
Right.
It just puts them someplace else. And we're running out of time. The best available climate science says that, you've heard this by now, we have roughly a decade left to reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50%. So in that sense, this is just a PR tactic. It's greenwashing. Yeah. And finally, let's take this to the limit. We already mentioned 2045. By 2045, New York State is trying to get to 0 emissions. How do you offset when you're trying to get to 0? Yeah. All you're saying is we'll never get to 0 because we're going to take our emissions and pay for somebody else to reduce theirs, but ours are going to still go on, which means the emissions are never 0. There won't be anybody to offset with soon in New York State. So those are 4 of what I think are strong arguments for this offsetting, as I said, being nothing more than PR greenwashing, saying, oh, we're very sensitive to environmental stewardship. If you were, you wouldn't be operating the most inefficient plant that you could possibly operate. And you will decide to conform to CLCPA mandates, even though currently you don't have to. No,
Has Greenidge said anything about the methane emissions and the methane, costs of the leakages along the way? Have they addressed that point?
no, no. What they've said is we're conforming to all DEC air emission requirements. And the DEC says you only have to count, currently, you only have to count methane emissions at the plant.
Right.
And they're saying we're doing that.
Yes.
But the methane emissions at the plant are less than 1%. Less than 1% of all the methane emissions upstream, which they're politely ignoring.
Well, this is great. Would you be willing to share your slides with us so that we could put them with the recording on the website? Okay, if you
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll
send them to
send them
me
to you.
and I'll pass them along.
I'll do that as soon as we're done tonight.
I don't see any further questions. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to raise?
Well, Tony, I was wondering about other countries and other states. Are there people advocating, against this, a bit against Bitcoin mining? Are there, obviously in New York that didn't gain traction this time, or are there states where they have been able to make traction in terms of addressing this as a climate change issue?
Partial answer to your question. In terms of, are there states like state governments or regulatory authorities that have already taken substantial steps to control this growing process? I don't know. Are all the major green organizations, Sierra Club, NRDC, Environmental Defense Fund, Earth Justice, Earthworks, have they already gone forward and said, hey, this is bad? Yes, they all have, in one way or another. CBS News is going to have a special sometime soon, next couple of days, next couple of weeks, where they've interviewed people around the country, including me. And they're trying to bring a national focus to this issue. They're trying to inform the American public that this is something that should be considered as impacting our efforts to control climate change. So the media, there have been articles in the Ithaca Journal, New York Times, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, all of them pointing out the give and take pros and cons of increasingly large scale Bitcoin mining in the US. So it's becoming part of the national awareness. But direct answer to your question, I don't know of any state yet that has changed its regulations, passed new regulations, enforced new regulations, try to ride herd on this growing effort. Not yet. We would have hoped New York State would have been the first. I'm not going to say anything about our governor at this point.
Tony, one more for you. What do we know about other plants being retrofitted or pressed into service to mine Bitcoin in New York or otherwise?
In New York, there's rumors.
Yeah.
I don't know of any confirmed, but there are other plants in the country much larger than Greenidge, which have been purchased by private investors and also by oil and gas companies. If you're an oil and gas company and you're trying to make sure that you're not stranding your gas assets because of the green revolution, you follow what I'm saying so far?
Yep.
You create additional demand for the gas. And so there are oil and gas companies that have purchased old coal-fired power plants and they're recycling them into gas-fired power plants to increase demand for the natural gas that they want to continue to mine. Ugly.
Yeah. And we need to let you go in a minute, but do you have any comments about the political aspects? What can be done here? Which politicians are being helpful on the subject? Should we be approaching the governor's office or the DEC? I know this is not your business, but you also know your way around. So
Well, yeah, and this is
what can you tell
this
us?
is being recorded, so I'm going to be very careful about what I say, right? No, not really. What are they going to do? Fire me? So Anna Kellis is the New York State Assembly representative for my county,
Right.
and some of the surrounding area. And
Right.
she was the progenitor of this proposed new law to enact a moratorium on additional Bitcoin mining operations in New York State. So she's my hero. She's one of the people that has been interviewed by CBS, so you'll see her on CBS.
And she knows her stuff.
It's Dr. Kellis. Don't underestimate her.
Yeah.
So.
And in the Senate, she's in the Assembly. What about the Senate side?
I don't know.
Rachel May, I believe, has been very active on this as well, and her district overlaps, I believe, the diocese.
I would expect her to be one of the advocates for control.
Right. And the governor?
At the governor level, I'm not afraid to say that for all the good aspects of Governor Cuomo, from my position of having spent 12 years working in the fracking wars, what I call the fracking wars, the shale gas wars, I watched him dilly-dally.
Yeah.
And in the same year, we're close to it, that he let his health minister say, let there not be any shale gas development in New York State. People call that forbidding fracking, but it doesn't really forbid fracking. It just forbids getting gas out of shale. In the same year, roughly the same year that he did that, he let the Economic Development Authority of New York State give these guys $10 million to build a pipeline. So that's what I've seen for 12 years of going to Albany, testifying before the legislature, being an advocate against shale gas development in all of its infrastructure, including 2 very, very large gas-fired new power plants in downstate New York.
Yeah.
And in one of those, Governor Cuomo's factotum, his closest associate, is now in jail for having gamed the system to get permits for that plant to be operated.
Right.
So you can read between my lines.
Yes. Yes.
I hope you can read between my lines.
Yes. Yes.
Tony, one last question. There's a lot of folks on here who have been talking about advocacy work and how to, join with other groups and other concerned citizens. Are there any groups or movements that you're aware of that you would strongly urge our group to join with? Groups that are you think maybe have a possible chance to really address these issues?
I think the groups that I would recommend first would be Sierra Club and Earthworks.
Mhm.
Earth Justice has been assigning some of its attorneys. Earth Justice is a legal firm. And it's been assigning attorneys to look at these issues. I've been working with one of them here in New York State with respect to Greenidge.
Mm-hmm.
Earthworks, full disclosure, I just retired as a member of the board of Earthworks, but they do community protection action.
Yeah.
And they also do some degree of lobbying at the state level and at the federal level. And Sierra has come out very strongly, as has NRDC. So with any big green organization like Sierra, NRDC, EDF, you get what you pay for. Sometimes they say all the right things for the right reasons. Sometimes they say the right things for the wrong reasons, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, they're saying they're all the right things. So I would try to make contact with Earthworks and Sierra first.
Earth Justice. I mean, those guys, I've worked with them up in the Adirondacks, and they're extremely professional. And I know they filed written comments with the DEC on the permit renewals.
Yes.
What are there any local groups, Tony, that you might?
Well, Yvonne Taylor from the Seneca Lake What's,
Guardian.
you know Yvonne, right?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, work with her.
Okay.
Well, I'm really grateful again for you being with us and the help and understanding and deepening our knowledge. And I know we're a little bit over time, but I thank you for your willingness to share with us and talk with us.
Well, thank you for sticking with me over time.
Is
Professor,
there-
it's very hard to tell professors to shut up.
well, yeah, the rule is you never give a bishop a microphone or professors, I think, so it's okay. They understand. Are there any questions before we go? And excuse me, I have a question. As we develop our understanding and go forward, would you be willing for us to call on you from time to time to
Absolutely, yes.
help us
Feel
with
free.
our?
Be glad to help.
Well, thank you very much for being here, and Richard, thank you for your advocacy.
Oh,
And Tony,
Yeah.
Truitt.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
thank you, Bishop.
Good night.
Good night.
Blessings to
Be
you all.
well.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.